Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Crocker from Sociology, in case you don't know. And I think everyone knows Carrie, who's here today to do a presentation on her MA research. I won't say much more about it. Her title is Temporary Tool or Long-Term Business Strategy, Assessing Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program. I think Carrie will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, is that right? And then there'll be time for discussions and questions. So thanks, everybody, for coming, and here we go.
Hello, I'd also like to say thank you for everyone for coming. It's encouraging to see such a great turnout here today. I would also like to first say an extra special thank you to Dr. Crocker for guiding me through this paper. It's been a long journey, and I'm glad we're at the end. So for this presentation, I will be reviewing Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program and assessing whether it is a temporary tool, as the name would imply, or if instead it has become a long-term government strategy to prop up business profits with racialized labor and protect corporations from global competition. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program is premised on the need for employers to deal with acute skills shortages on a temporary basis, and it's used only as a last resort. The program is constructed as a citizens first policy, as it requires employers to make efforts to hire domestic workers before seeking migrant labor. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program was formally institutionalized in Canada in 1966 through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, which, as the name suggests, brings in farm workers, and has been expanded several times, including in 1973 with the Non-Immigrant Employment Authorization Program, which was a small program aimed at high-skilled workers, in 1982 with the Foreign Domestic Program, which was renamed the Live-In Caregiver Program in 1992, which brings in live-in caregivers, in 2001 with a pilot project for occupations requiring lower levels of formal training, which has become a permanent feature of the program, and more recently in 2014 with the International Mobility Program, which is a less restricted program that admits workers from the global north. These various expansions of the program have considerably increased the number of foreign workers in Canada, with the biggest increases taking place after the introduction of the low-skilled stream and the International Mobility Program. While the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is framed as a tool of last resort, there has been a growing use of the program in areas such as Newfoundland and Labrador, where in recent years the number of temporary foreign workers has doubled the number of permanent resident immigrants. This is despite the province's high unemployment rate, which would suggest that there is a greater ability to hire locally. Since this program is outside of the standard permanent resident immigration streams, the growth of the program in Newfoundland and Labrador has been excluded from the immigration discourse, and temporary foreign workers are largely absent from Newfoundland and Labrador's immigration strategies. Despite the government's insistence that the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is limited to acute skills shortages, there is significant evidence that the program is being used to supply structural labor shortages in Canada. In 2012, the Department of Human Resources and Skills Development Canada found that occupations filled by the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program and the Live-In Caregiver Program remained of lower interest to Canadian workers, even in areas with high unemployment, and stated that demand for temporary foreign workers in these occupations will continue despite a recent downturn in the economy because of the limited desirability of temporary, low-skilled, seasonal, live-in, and harvest work amongst Canadian workers. In 2014, reforms to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program restricted use of the program, but these reforms did not apply to either the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program or the Live-In Caregiver Program, both of which have been part of the Canadian labor market for more than 30 years. The Maritime Seafood Coalition in 2016 successfully advocated against restrictions that limited use of the program in the seafood industry, despite evidence that citizens in this industry were being laid off to hire temporary foreign workers. These exemptions highlight how the Canadian government recognizes low-wage foreign workers as a structural part of the labor market. Rather than filling an acute labor shortage, this limited desirability of temporary, rural, low-skilled, low-wage, seasonal, and live-in work suggests that these jobs are rejected by Canadian citizens who are refusing 3D jobs, or jobs that are dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. Citizens of the economically rich global north have systemically been protected from menial work by social security benefits, but these countries still need this work done. These underattended menial jobs are where the Temporary Foreign Worker Program comes into play. Migration was and is vital to the increased productivity demanded of capitalism and increasing trade. Cohen argues that this is because a constant flow of subordinate labor is a systemic requirement of capitalism. Guest worker programs were widely used in Europe after the Second World War to reconstruct the cities destroyed by the war. And more recently, fast-growing nations in the Gulf states and Asia are utilizing temporary migration programs to accelerate their growth. This global phenomenon of recruiting migrants for low-wage labor has been important to Canada's industrial growth as well. Canada's history of recruiting racialized migrant labor can be dated back to the 1880s, when Chinese laborers were recruited to build the Trans-Canada Railway. These workers were given the worst jobs with the lowest pay, and still their employment sparked outrage within the citizen population, stoked by racist fears that these workers were criminals and carried disease. The Canadian railway owners, however, insisted that they needed these workers because they worked harder, and protected their recruitment strategy from government interference. Seeking a compromise, Prime Minister Macdonald introduced a policy preventing Chinese migrants from remaining in Canada. When the railway neared completion in 1885, a head tax of $50 was placed on Chinese immigrants to prevent further settlement. In 2006, the Canadian government, under Stephen Harper, formally apologized for the Chinese head tax, stating it was an unfortunate part of Canadian history, and that his government will continually strive to ensure that similar unjust practices are never allowed to happen again. And yet, under Harper, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program grew significantly, and the basic principles of those early recruitment strategies are still around and are becoming normalized. Migrant workers continue to sustain economic growth in Canada and reduce costs by minimizing the price of labor. The tension between citizen and migrant labor highlighted in the railway example remains, and yet the use of temporary migrant workers in Canada has grown because this employer-driven immigration is fundamental to the global capitalist structure. The segmentation of a racialized migrant labor force prevalent in Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program is used to achieve labor market flexibility. By recruiting a labor force that is eager to work low wages offered because of global inequality structures and crafting it to be compliant to the policy framework of the program, the Canadian state is able to protect dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs so that firms can maintain the profit margins. This is producing a new permanent class of people with qualified rights. Individual workers come and go, but the regulatory structure means that there is always available a class of workers with less rights to work the jobs that Canadians reject. While there are many policies regulating the Temporary Foreign Worker Program in Canada, the implementation of these policies is highly skewed and tend to protect employers while exploiting workers. Migrant workers face significant barriers accessing these protections because of their legal status, short stay, and weak language skills. And the government has put significant resources into helping employers access this flexible labor supply, but limited resources into the oversight of the program to ensure that it protects the rights and interests of temporary foreign workers. This has served to create a two-tiered labor force, as migrant workers are offered little protections within Canada and are thus disciplined into complete compliance. In my paper, I argue that Canada uses micro and macro control mechanisms to discipline this migrant workforce. Micro control mechanisms are policies that affect workers while they are in Canada, while macro control mechanisms focus on leveraging Canada's position within the world system. Micro control mechanisms include closed work permits that bind workers to a single employer, social isolation of living in rural regions and not speaking an official language, a confusing administrative bureaucracy, and the employer-driven citizenship process. I discuss these more in my paper, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on the more egregious control mechanisms. By making employers responsible for so many aspects of an individual's life, including where they work, where they live, and what they know about a country's legal framework, the Canadian government has created a system that gives employers considerable control over their employees' private lives. Studies have found vagrant abuse of the program, where temporary foreign workers were being paid less than their Canadian coworkers, were working in substandard conditions, accepting requests outside their work contracts, and that people had been fired after suffering a workplace injury. Furthermore, studies have found that these workers were living in accommodations that lacked proper plumbing or heat and were crowded and decrepit. As an employer-driven system, employees must please their employer to stay. Without citizen rights, if low-wage migrant workers are dismissed, they are effectively deported because of the strict regulations placed on their closed work permit. Fear of deportation forces workers to agree to employer requests outside the work contract, such as lower wages and working overtime without extra pay or in unsafe conditions, as their stay in Canada depends on satisfying their employer. By targeting lower income countries, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program utilizes Canada's position in the world system to extract low-cost labor. This macro control mechanism allows Canada access to a disciplined labor force. The relative difference between wages in the global north and south is the biggest motivating factor for workers coming to Canada, and remittances can be an important source of income for families in the global south. These resources can increase household income and encourage investment in education, health, housing, and infrastructure. However, the potential earnings offered by migration can encourage workers to accept substandard working conditions and is exploited by high-income countries to create a two-tiered labor force. Macro control mechanisms include changing labor supply countries over time to ensure a compliant labor supply. If one country's economy increases, so workers begin demanding higher wages or greater rights, firms can just change countries. This pattern was found in the Seasonal Agriculture Worker Program and has been expanded to the Low-Skilled Temporary Foreign Worker Program, as firms are no longer limited to countries with which Canada has a bilateral agreement. Because migrant workers feel easily replaced, they are more likely to accept unsafe work. Recruiting the lowest income workers is another technique used to create a compliant labor force, and is evident in recruitment strategies utilized by public and private agencies. By targeting more rural areas where people are poorer and have more incentive to migrate, recruiters are better able to ensure obedience from their workforce. Now that we have established that temporary foreign workers are recruited to create a compliant labor force within Canada for dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs, we must answer the question of how this is allowed in such a tolerant country such as ours. Harris argues that the nation-state was created to protect people from the volatility of capitalism, and that this rested on the construction of a social contract, which included a welfare state to shield its citizens from unemployment. The arrival of the socialized state made those from abroad a problem. And by the 1920s, most industrialized nations had constructed laws to control movement between their borders. The construction of migrant workers as an other is related to this rise of nationalism and the creation of the imagined community, whereby individuals create their identity by excluding others. By structuring difference, the nation-state is able to extract profit out of a cheapened labor force. While today, immigrants are generally marked as visible minorities, this discrimination of immigrants marked as the other can be found in the 19th century, when immigrants migrating within Europe were very similar culturally and racially. Even in situations such as migrants from East Germany moving west, immigrants are treated as other and racialized. While this fact is diluted when cultural differences between immigrants and residents is greater, a look at Europe's past makes it clear that the simple fact that the immigrant is an outsider might be the chief factor behind the experience of difference. Within Canada's multicultural policies, differences between race are being minimized, but there is increasing focus on protecting cultural integrity and emphasizing differences based on nationhood. While Canada presents itself as a tolerant nation, welcome to immigrants, Banerjee argues that Canada's multicultural policy has been an administrative device to manage social contradictions within the country and present the nation as a homogeneous entity. Banerjee constructs multiculturalism as a central pillar in Canada's ideological apparatus, as it unites the country by creating an other and by recognizing difference, neutralizes it. This is the dark side of the nation that reduces continuing social relations of domination based on Eurocentric, racist, and colonial structures. Hodge argues that this has created an economy of otherness, where the devaluation of labor performed by those who do not fit the white male ideal is exactly what gives them value to their employer, as their lower social value makes them more exploitable. By using nationalist tropes to produce racialized differences, the state is able to construct a homogeneous, non-white immigrant that is allowed to be exploited. Through these state practices, some residents have been created as part of the national family and others as outsiders. In this way, the other helps define the nation and those who identify with such. To separate the other from a nation's citizenry, the state has created a legal framework that admits immigrants but continues to exempt them from the social benefits of citizenship. Immigrants are constructed through law and policy as partial subjects, without access to the same rights as the nation's citizens. Because of their low language skills, weak political leverage, and desperation for work, foreign-born workers have historically been vulnerable to exploitation. Cohen argues that while forms of involuntary labor have always existed within capitalism, they have changed based on the growth of globalization, which has created a new underclass of workers. Banerjee defines this as a process of neocolonialism that has created hierarchical citizenship that allows Canada to be imagined as a homogeneous, solid, and settled entity, though its history constantly belies this. In this way, whiteness works as an ideology of a nation-state and assists with the recruitment and exploitation of imported labor along lines of race and gender. While temporary migrant workers are put in working conditions that would appall a citizen, the control has been unchallenged because the Temporary Foreign Worker Program works within hegemonic notions of Canadian nationness. As the use of racialized non-citizens for dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs is considered an act of charity rather than an exploitative labor strategy. Immigration policies have been a mechanism through which the nation-state has been able to organize and regulate differences to create a compliant, cheapened labor force that can be exploited for profit. Sharma refers to this as home economics, as it segments the labor force into those who belong and those who do not, and allows the state to normalize the use of an indentured labor force. This makes it easier for citizens to accept foreign workers as laborers and exclude them as not part of society. The labor market impact assessment, for example, helps legitimize the idea that migrants are to be employed only for jobs that Canadians refuse. This is used to construct the segmented labor force, which allows greater rights to citizens and conceals the disparities between the two groups of workers. It is within this context of white multiculturalism and neoliberal economic policies that Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program operates. While framed as temporary, the long history and expanding use of the program reveal a permanent solution to recruiting workers for dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs that citizens refuse. By comparing policy to practice, this paper has shown how Canada's immigration policy creates a vulnerable workforce that will comply to the poor working conditions in industries that deter Canadian workers. Rather than addressing real short-term labor shortages, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program has become a structural part of the Canadian labor market, whereby firms can hire foreign workers who will acquiesce to their demands. This has allowed the normalization of an exploitative immigration system that can be found in high-income countries around the world. Thank you.